Okay, well that's helpful. So today I'm going to talk about data, design, and hopefully impact, and share some of the work that Forum 1 has been doing with a couple of nonprofits that are using health data in particular to try to change their communities and ultimately the world. I mentioned this, I'm with Forum 1. Forum 1 is a full-service digital agency. We're headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia, but we have an office in DC, an office in Seattle. We're about 100 staff. We have about a half of our work is with government, both federal and state and local. We do peacecorps.gov, EPA.gov. We just won a Webby last year for our work with the Smithsonian for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Really proud of that. The other half of our work is with NGOs, research institutes, think tanks, and nonprofits. And we see a lot of similarities in those two spaces. And I think that even though the case studies I'm going to talk about today are non-federal, I think that they have a lot of applicability, particularly to kind of research-oriented agencies or those that are more kind of focused on civic engagement. Enough about us, though. And I'll say this now, and I'll say it again at the end. For those of you who raised your hand and said you are very technical, we are actively looking for senior technical architects. So listen carefully, and if you like what you see, come talk to me afterwards. So I'm going to start with a story about data and impact. Then I'm going to risk it and do some live demonstrations of the site, and then we'll dig under the hood and talk about what the technology is that we're using to power these sites. For us, we think that data for impact, really changing the world for the good with data, it really is about getting the right data to the right audiences within the right context. It's kind of that simple. But to underlie that story or that message, I want to rewind over 100 years and start at the Crimean War. It'll come full circle. So the Crimean War, I don't know how many of you guys know your history. I don't know much about it, but I do know it was the French and the British primarily fighting with the Turks against the Russians for religious subcontext and some regional conflicts. That's not important. What is important, it was one of the first kind of modern wars prior to World War I, where lots of casualties, big weaponry, big armies, and conditions were horrible. People were dying in droves, lots and lots of casualties. Very poor way, not really good ways to treat them. And as you'd expect in the 1800s, there was also really poor data collection. You might think that doesn't matter, but there wasn't. People had a sense that things were going really badly, but didn't have anything quantitative to help them figure it out. We're lucky that there was a nurse around at the time who was there at the front, who was sent to try to improve those conditions. Anyone guess who it is? Yes, Florence Nightingale, yeah. So there was and in fact, she was pretty into statistics and data, luckily for us and for the data visualization geeks of the future. This is a Florence Nightingale quote. She says that to understand God's thoughts, we must study statistics, for these are the measure of his purpose. I don't know that I'm that fervent about them, but I'm glad that she was. So that was Florence Nightingale. It just so happened at the time, and we're lucky that she was kind of enamored with this statistics stuff, because it was pretty obvious from just walking around in the time that there were more soldiers that were dying within the hospitals from preventable diseases, from infection, than from the actual battle wounds. This was kind of clear to see, and she was able to make really concrete changes on the ground, which were improving conditions and reducing infections immediately, right? But she wanted to make a bigger impact than that. She didn't want to just change conditions for the hospitals in the Crimean War. She was really looking to go beyond that. She wanted to have a more sustainable impact on how we're getting better at treating our soldiers, for example, in the long term. About half a generation prior, the very first bar chart had been published, and this was in the context of business. It was in 1786, and she was actually a student of statistics. A contemporary of Nightingale's was John Snow, and he's the one who famously mapped the cholera outbreaks in London to pinpoint and identify that they were actually coming from water sources. So she was a student of this and kind of understood that understanding data was really a way. It's like an avenue to a solution, right? And it could be an avenue to a solution not just for an immediate context, but for a bigger impact context. She also, in the hospital situation in the Crimean War, she was working directly with this gentleman, William Farr, who had this as kind of his approach for statistics, which was, well, I'll let you read it. I don't know if any of you guys have ever worked with William Farr with the data projects that you're on, right? But I think that luckily for us, Florence Nightingale recognized that she really understood who her real audience was, right? And her audience was Her Majesty, the Prime Minister, and the military. Ultimately, she wanted these folks to understand the data in ways that they would take action to change what was being done to support soldiers, ultimately, right? Better conditions in hospitals. And so she went to the front, collected data, right? So this is what she wanted, kind of near term. Like, obviously, she wanted those conditions to improve in the immediate term, but really, she wanted to reduce deaths. She wanted to make a bigger, longer-standing impact, right? So here's the outcome. At the end of the day, this whole preamble is about this, and you can see that this chart is it's called I forget. Does anyone know the actual polar diagram? Is what they're calling them these days, but it's also called like a Nightingale rose, I think, is what it's also called. But this shows monthly deaths and the causes of death within the Crimean War from 1854 through 1856. And this simple chart, which has the red in each month, is how many deaths were from wounds, the blue is from disease, and the black is from other causes. It's pretty obvious that the major cause of death was disease, right? It wasn't actually wounds on the battlefield. And so the military cares about this. They can obviously want this to get a lot better. But a year later, with some institutional changes, it goes down to just 46 deaths. I think part of that is the war itself winding down. But the point is she was able to institute these big changes, right? And the report that she delivered and to this audience, it's not just that it reduced this death rate from 42% to 2% year over year, but as a result of her engagement, by leading with the data in the right context, delivering it to the right person, right? The Royal Commission on the Health of the Army was established as a result after the Crimean War, largely due to her impact. The very first Army Medical College was established in Great Britain. The establishment of the sanitary department within the Indian government happened. So at the end of the day, she made an impact far bigger than just what she was sent to do, which is improve conditions in hospitals on the ground in the Crimean War. And really, and maybe this is hyperbole, data and the importance of data was a big part of that, right? It's a huge part of how that happened, right? And we like to think that data is just important today for all of the engagement that you guys are having with your own audiences, right? It's likely that you have data in lots of different types and lots of different places within your agencies. And some of you may have data that's more directly relatable to kind of health metrics and statistics. Some of you might have operational data. Some might be financial data. But the data is important today for a lot of your key audiences because data can help increase how your agency is perceived from accountability perspective. Maybe it's how we're spending our money. It can increase transparency. It can increase how you're collaborating with other agencies to solve similar problems, so sharing data. Policy influence. I mean, data is critical in gaining the attention of policymakers and influencers on the Hill. Data is increasingly important in influencing public opinion. And ultimately, the media loves to write a story that has like a really concrete data point, right? So data is important today. And we've been lucky enough to work with a couple of different organizations that have a lot of data, and they do happen to be focused on health impact. The results of these haven't been quite as dramatic as the Florence Nightingale's establishment of health colleges in the UK, but I think that they're pretty exciting projects in and of themselves. So County health rankings and roadmaps is one of the projects I'm going to walk you guys through, and the other is called the City Health Dashboard. They're related, and they have a shared funder in the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but they are operated completely separately. They're really not the same project or program at all, but they do share a pretty similar goal, and that is to basically provide data, right, that is a baseline, comprehensive, reliable place for people who are trying to improve health to go to, right? It can be a baseline and a foundation from which they can understand what's happening within their communities, and then to arm communities and people that are trying to make an impact with mechanisms to do that better. That's ultimately their goal. And again, to kind of underscore this, like this difference between data for just like a near-term gain versus data for impact, this is the vision for the county health rankings program, which I kind of like, which is to build a national culture of health. It's not just to like share the data. It's not just to let people understand which counties are healthier and which ones aren't. It's really to enable the society to make smarter decisions because of real quantifiable data. So let's look at them. Any questions about that? Does it make sense? Okay. All right, I'm going to start with county health rankings. So again, I start off by saying that putting the right data in front of like the right people within the right context is kind of the mantra of what we want to make sure that we're doing. And so county health rankings, what it does is it has health metrics, individual data points going back to 2008 for about 75 different health metrics. And those metrics are organized by health outcome, like deaths, right? And quality of life. And health factors, things that impact that. And that could be anything from smoking to obesity to your access to foods to walkability of your neighborhood, right? So there's about 76 different, and you can actually explore at the county level, going back to 2008 annually, all of these data points, right? And they're explored through the context of ranking, which was an important way of helping put context to the important audiences that they were trying to reach. So for within every single state, they rank every single county on these measures. So I can go see if Alexandria City, where we stack up in health factors against Arlington, for example. So if I'm a health policy maker, if I'm a state and local or municipal administrator, or I'm a nonprofit community organizer, I can get real detailed data right there. The other big thing is to move people to take action to change, right? So a lot of the program and the site is not just the data, but it's the context around it. Who do I talk to? What can I do? What's the evidence-based research and policies that are related to the data that can help me form a program to make change in my city? So that's all of this taking action. And then who do you connect with and who do you learn from? So if we were to, I'm going to start here because this isn't even the data, but again, it's important because it's not just about the data visualizations, it's about the context through which we're delivering all of the data itself. So there's a huge body of work on the site that is evidence-based academic research for programmatic change on health factors. So I can look and see if I want to change the quality of care in my community. I have here's 35 individual articles and evidence-based research. So this one says it's scientifically supported. Let's see if any of them are not scientifically supported. But I can filter, this is, you guys would recognize this from a Drupal perspective. All of this is just content that's being filtered. But all of these things are associated with the metrics that they're tracking, right? From learn from others, actually here, let me go back to, if I want to see who to work with, this kind of gets to understanding your audiences and who it is that you want to take action with your data. Unfortunately, County Health Rankings set of primary audiences, we built personas for them. They have 9, which I think is probably too many, but at least that they are providing the context to those core audiences to engage with the data in ways that they want them to, right? It helps them understand the data. So there's different places for different types of folks who they believe will be engaged in their communities to drive health change, and they provide them with toolkits and resources to get them there. But let's look at the actual health rankings themselves. Who's got a hometown that's not near here? Give me a state.
California, San Diego.
California. Let's just go back and start with California. All right. So California is a big state. So the first thing I see is the rankings, which have been interesting and somewhat controversial as a way to engage people in data. The rankings themselves have been a huge boon for CHR, as they call themselves, with the media in particular. This is an annual report, so they compile the data annually and they release it once a year in one big swoop. So at the state and local level, all the way from the national level to the local county Tribune newspaper can write a story about where, are we doing well, are we doing poorly, and from a ranking perspective. So I can see which counties are ranking the highest in health outcomes and which counties are ranking the lowest, and which are ranking the highest and which are ranking the lowest in these health factors. Let's look at the rankings themselves. So I can see the Marin County overall is purportedly the healthiest, right? I can drill into Marin. Oh, sorry. So we said San Diego. What's this county surrounding San Diego?
San Diego.
Oh, San Diego. There we go. So we'll do San Diego, right? So I can see in my overall rank. I can also see how I rank in other areas, health behaviors, clinical care, right? So this is interesting. I can get stories from the rankings, but the measures themselves are. Oh, you moved up a little bit in health behavior. Or no, where'd you go? San Diego. There you go. You dropped in health behaviors. So you got better health outcomes when you have behaviors. It's interesting, right? Let's look at we're looking at San Diego now, and we were talking kind of about context and discovery. It can be hard when you don't. The purpose of the county health rankings isn't to find the one thing for a county to change. It's to provide the information so that they can reveal change to themselves and they can use this as a resource, because the researchers couldn't do that for every single, there's 3,500 counties in the United States. So it has tools like show areas to explore. So if I click this, it'll highlight some areas that the researchers, for whatever reason, think that this is interesting, right? And this is interesting, right? Well, we just saw that your health outcomes, you're 10th in the state of California. You were in health behaviors, which are things like these, you were 18th, and you've got higher than average excessive drinking and adult smoking in San Diego County. So maybe if I'm a community organizer, I'm interested in those things, right? So let's get into excessive drinking. I can now see, I still have the map here, so if I want to zoom in, this is on county level, so I can see it pretty quickly. But if I want to see actual policies, again, these are those same evidence-based research. These are programs that I can now go and study, that if I wanted to put in place a family treatment drug court in San Diego to reduce that excessive drinking. Right? These are actual evidence-based research of other programs that have worked that are linked to, right? This is actual study. So this is a big body of work. So that's basically the story of county health rankings and how they've attempted to kind of unify this exploration platform for data with a lot of context that I'm not really going into here around the guides and how to actually let me just look at that one thing. So this how to take action. The site itself is trying to it does a tremendous amount to try to educate folks on how to use the data within their own communities. So they have this whole framework of how to make progress on health through this kind of framework of steps. So there's kind of like a toolkit for folks to be able to use. They also provide almost like a consultancy to counties themselves. So counties can pick up the phone and work with them directly in order to help improve their policies and programs. All right. County Health Rankings is a project that's evolved we've worked on it since 2009, I believe. So that core data platform has gone through a couple of iterations, but it has been around for a long time, and it's time series data. This is a new initiative. This is called the City Health Dashboard, and it's really more about the data, and it has a little bit more interesting data kind of visualization and exploration tools on it. So this project is also funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It is operated by New York University's School of Population Health, the Langone Center. And it started as a program within that research center for the similar health metrics to county health rankings, but they're at the census tract level. A lot of municipal decision makers, policy makers, health influencers. A county is not a city, and a city is not a county, and a census tract is certainly, if I'm a local politician, a census tract is definitely not a county, right? The borders overlap. And so there's kind of a lack of census tract level data in an aggregated way across, for health, for policymakers. So that was what, and they started with 4 cities. Robert Wood Johnson said, wow, that's fantastic. Thank you for doing it for 4 cities. Can you do it for 500 cities? So they got money from Robert Wood Johnson to scale up that data set from 4 cities to 500 cities, and we were brought on as the partner to help bring it to life on the web. And that's what we're seeing here. So like county health rankings, the context is similar. They really want to move people from foundational data, quantitative data, through moving their community to act in a way that promotes health improvement. But it does this one does provide some more interesting tools. So you're going to start with the city context. Let's just start with Atlanta instead of asking. And here's all the different factors that they have data on at the census tract level. It's interesting that both City Health Dashboard and County Health Rankings include socioeconomic, like non-health factors that impact health as part of their data set as well. And so let's just look at like children in poverty, for example. And some of the things that we did with this data set itself is, in one respect, it seems really straightforward. It is a census tract, a metric, right? And they tend to be percentage, right? Percentage of the population that have this, that, or the other, right? But in some cases, the data is better if they're lower values, right? So I want to have my city to have very low children in poverty, though on the inequality measure, I want my city to probably be somewhere in the middle. I don't want it to be on the extremes. Whereas my high school graduation rate, I want to make sure that the indicator is better on the higher end, right? So when I'm looking across these metrics, we call this sense making. So a lot of time and energy went into the design to make sure that this kind of relatively, it seems straightforward, but this complex data set could be understood as you're driving through the site. So we know where we are, some basic stuff about the city itself. Information about the metric that we started with. We're starting our exploration here, and we're trying to take the user through a pretty definitive journey here. I can learn about the metric. I can also view the metric in a couple different contexts. I can see that here's where the city average is for children in poverty. Here's where the 500 city average is across the 5. So we're doing good, right? I'm sorry, we're doing poorly in Atlanta. We've got a higher percentage of people in poverty, children in poverty than the average, right? But I can look at this range here from 0 to 95%. That's the range of children in poverty within census tracts in Atlanta, right? But what if I want to see it in context with the 500 cities? So actually not a big change, but in some cities it's a big difference, right? I can look at the map, and I can see the ranking itself. I'm going to add them to this like kind of note thing as does anyone know Atlanta? Where should I look here? Give me a zip code. 303 331, is that what I heard? 330. Oh. I don't see it. But anyway, so I can see all these different census tracts and zip codes, and I can also view details for each of these things. So I can see how this one is performing, again, against the average in cities. I can see that I'm performing better, right, than this average. And I can also see how I stack up in the distribution within Atlanta for this particular census tract, right? So I'm at 3.2, so I'm down here. I'm in this cluster with most of them. So there's a lot of ways for me to make sense of the data at the individual metric level. I can also see data about how this breaks down by socioeconomic or demographic detail, right? And again, I think I mentioned this, but we're making these kind of human readable statements that let that hopefully explain the data in a way that makes sense to someone rather than just having to interpret the chart itself. So you can see here. So it breaks it down by demographics. I also have the opportunity to not just drill in, but to see across the broad spectrum, like where I kind of sit as a city on all of these. So I can open everything, and I can kind of give like a squint test, right? And I can kind of see my green checks over top of these things to see, okay, I'm performing better here, I'm performing worse here, I'm performing better here. And I can also drill into these to get an overview of what's happening for each one of these individual. And I can also click back into that detail view if I want to. I can also compare one city to another city at the city level, right? So if I want to just compare Atlanta to an individual city, I can just put it in here. But more interesting is to be able to find other cities based upon characteristics that I have as a city or city in this case myself. So I can say I want to see cities that with population similar to Atlanta, which is the context we're in right now, and I want to see ones that have similar poverty level. Oh, that's interesting. So Stockton, California. I don't know if the policymakers in Atlanta know that Stockton, California and Atlanta share these two similarities. Of the 500 biggest cities are the only ones that have the similar federal poverty level and populations. It's kind of interesting. I didn't know that before I clicked on there. I can also filter my list of cities based upon health factors too, obviously, right? So I want to see ones that have similar park access. So here's those cities, and if I want to add them to my comparative list, I can see, right, how I compare, right? So again, this is like data exploration for folks where this data matters for their job, and the goal is to provide them with ways to set baselines so that they can further engage. I'm still looking at children in poverty here. Let's change this to like a health outcome. Let's do diabetes. Oh, yeah, where's diabetes? There it is. And I can compare across metrics now too. So I'm looking at diabetes. Let's compare diabetes now to children in poverty. And I can see for any of the two metrics for which there is census tract data, I can see correlation between those two, so I can discover whether or not there is a correlation. In this case, it looks like there's not a super strong correlation, but certainly a loose correlation between diabetes and children in poverty. And for metrics that they have demographic breakdowns, I can also see how those breakdowns occur across the demographic lines, comparing the two things. Diabetes, they only have, they don't have a demographic breakdown for this particular data set. But these are pretty sophisticated tools for folks interested in health at their community level to, and then I can also, what's interesting here is that this data set of resources is using the County Health Rankings evidence-based research library that County Health Rankings has been investing in for over a decade in building. And rather than this program, they're funded by the same folks, rather than this program reinventing the wheel, we're just simply pulling those resources out of the County Health Rankings database. Yeah?
When you say pulling the data, is it on a spreadsheet or?
And I'll get behind the scenes a bit on all of these things. For the data visualizations that we're looking at, the data is in a database. It's Cardo for County Health Rankings, Postgres for City Health Dashboard is Cardo, and Postgres is for County Health Rankings. But this content database is stored in Drupal. So this evidence-based research, like this culture-adapted healthcare, this will actually link me, but we're just using that API that's provided by County Health Rankings to tag it to that metric in City Health Dashboard, and that's what's populating this take action. So if I'm viewing diabetes, it'll pull diabetes data. If I'm viewing cardiovascular disease, it'll pull different resources. And this is all coming, you can see here, the source is County Health Rankings, but because County Health Rankings has an API, we're able to pull that in automatically onto the city health. City.
Is that open source or is it?
I don't know that they publicly released the CHR API, but it exists, and its usage. They would love for you to get in touch if you wanted to use it. Yeah. So we built the whole. So the entire thing that we just saw, the data visualization, all runs on top of this API as well for County Health Rankings. So I'm going to switch. So that and then there's an opportunity for cities to share their stories here. But this is the overarching context of this big data set, and we hope that it's a good example of how, like, combining kind of thoughtful design, thoughtful UX patterns can lead folks that care about these things to incorporate it in their work and make a change. So now let's shift gears completely, and we can talk a little bit about under the hood, because I'm sure you guys have questions here. So both of the sites are powered by Drupal to varying degrees. As you guys know, this is the traditional, very oversimplified view of how Drupal architects itself from kind of front end and back end. So if we're thinking about like the core CMS functions on the back end of traditional Drupal, content creation, content authoring, permissioning, workflow, that's all handled by Drupal, right? Drupal also handles layout and rendering and placement and conditional logic on the front end. So Drupal does it all traditionally, as we know. It's one programming language that does all of these things. That's PHP. The front end code is Twig, and the templating language. It's all Drupal, right? The data store is managed by Drupal. This is regular Drupal. Let's call it that, right? There's this, you probably heard folks talk about, maybe that's why you're here, but the notion of decoupling the back end from the front end in Drupal, right? So what Drupal does really, really well on the back end, organize content, handle workflows, handle permissioning. There's some reasons where you might want the front end application to not be beholden to the rules that Drupal uses for the front end, right? Because Drupal was designed to manage web pages, right? Not web applications necessarily. And so if you want to have things like, we want complete control of the interface. Every time we checked a box or moved a slider or selected a different district, all those in-page interactions, the control of those things are all happening outside of the context of Drupal in the case that we were looking at. And so you can build app-like interfaces that are using data that's stored in Drupal and using its strength there without having to be beholden to how Drupal wants to manage the layouts and that sort of thing. So that's a big thing. Another big advantage of this decouple thing, which is not in place for these two projects we just looked at, but what if you're designing, if you want, you're designing a chatbot, right? It's not a browser even that you're delivering your information to, but it's actually stored in Drupal, right? So decoupled Drupal can enable you to write an application for any purpose, a kiosk, a chatbot, Alexa, Google Home, what have you, by leveraging the web services components of Drupal. So that's, and if we look at county health or city health dashboard, the second example, this is a really grossly oversimplified look at the architecture there. We're using Drupal to manage what you would think of as like kind of the small amount of normal site content. I didn't show you the About Us pages, and there's a page for every metric, but the traditional web content, right? Drupal's managing all of that. Drupal's also managing a lot of metadata about the statistics themselves, but not the raw data. So when we saw those little sense-making statements, actually let me just, sorry, I started in a separate place. So, so when we looked at those sense-making, remember these little statements in here? 75% of Alexander's adults reported having diabetes. All of that data, the actual data point, the data metrics, they're stored in a separate database that Drupal doesn't know about or care about. But we are storing that meta information that helps us construct these things within Drupal. So our client can go in and for every single one of their metrics, in order for those sense-making statements to make sense, we have 5 different types of formats for this thing. There probably should be better help text there, but they know what they are. They use a word that describes what's the population, what's the verb that they're going to use to make this sentence, what's the short name we want to use for the metric instead of the actual name that's stored in the raw data database. So Drupal is playing a role here, and then that stuff is coming together to make this. We're using, and again, go way back up here, 100% of the front end is driven by a React JavaScript application. The charts and graphs are all D3. It's pulling some of that data from Drupal, but the actual map tiles are coming from Carto, and the GIS data, the chloropleth, and the data points themselves are all stored in Carto. Hopefully that makes sense. If we look at county health rankings, which is similar but different, we would say that county health rankings is using this approach that the people are calling a progressively decoupled approach. So for county health rankings, if we look at a page on county health rankings like this one, Drupal still owns the overall layout. Drupal's front end is delivering the header, the footer, the wrapper, the navigation structure. We're using traditional menus in Drupal, in the normal Drupal construction sense. But everything in this overview, rankings, measures, downloads, selecting another thing, comparing to another county, these toggles, the maps serving themselves, that's in this case it's Angular. This was written prior to, so we switched from Angular to React at Form 1. But this is an Angular JS web application, and the mapping is being delivered by TileStream, a modified version of TileStream. So this is like JavaScript laying over top of Drupal's kind of core front end development, and it's a helpful way to build because we're not restricted to Drupal's limitations on particularly like in-page interactions. That's the kind of the main advantage that we get with this type of approach. So here, I stole this straight off of Dries's blog, so it's got to be right? This is some of the things that you can be considering as to whether or not this decoupling is really necessary for what you're trying to accomplish on the web. It worked for our teams in both of these cases because we wanted a high degree of control over the interface to do dynamic charting, graphing, and mapping. That was a pretty simple use case for why we chose to separate those. Drupal doesn't do those particularly well natively. React, D3, and Carto do them really well natively. So that's why we made the decision. This whole slide kind of boils down to is the project that you're going to create, how much front-end control do you want your editors to have? Are editors going to be in charge of layouts? Do they need to be able to preview live things before they hit publish? Those are just 2 specific examples that show like those are things where when Drupal is coupled, front end and back end, you get a lot of features that support editorial control, right? But you also get a lot of like it's locked down, right? So you get the benefits of. So those are if editorial control is a really, really critical need for your project, then keeping it coupled is probably a good idea. But it's a spectrum, it's not Boolean, right? The more you want to be able to design for other platforms, design for more interactivity and have developers have control over the interface, the more suitable it might be for a more fully decoupled experience. Another thing that talking to our tech lead for the City Health Dashboard project, so we went fully decoupled on that one. And one of the things that we're learning, so we just launched that site in May. We're now in year 2 and we're planning improvements to the site. And by decoupling them, we realized that we've put ourselves actually, if we want to add more traditional Drupal functionality to that site, that's actually going to be potentially a little bit harder than if we were more in this progressively decoupled area. We fully separated them out. So if we want to add whole sections to the site, right, if we might have to go back to and do a little bit of more refactoring to get it closer to a kind of progressively decoupled if we wanted to use Drupal's layout engine. Because if we look over here, if we're looking here, so you can see that this is a full Drupal path. It's a normal Drupal page. As soon as I get into anything here, see I'm here, now I'm in app. So we're like kind of taking over Drupal's routing. And this is now, and actually these clean URLs are what's powering this interface, right? So now in measures, but this routing is all being controlled by Angular, right? This is different from this site where everything here is powered by our JavaScript. Drupal doesn't have anything to do with our routing of these, of our actual URLs. So if we were to add a whole new section to the site that's really much more content-centric, we're probably going to have to think about how to do that if we want to leverage Drupal's front end again. So that was one of the takeaways that our tech arc brought to my attention when we were talking about this. So we actually made it through all this stuff. Did that. Big summary. We think the data is a critical tool for impact, right? Thoughtful design combined with your data, right? It is a way for you guys to reach and engage audiences, and as government agencies who are trying to improve the lives of citizens, that's ultimately what it's all about. Drupal and decoupled Drupal in particular can be a great tool in the toolkit for making that happen. With that, I'd love to give you guys back at least 8 minutes for questions. Yes?
That's a really nice interface. I have a question. It was hard for me to figure out where the sources of the data were, like the different indicators. That's the only thing.
Yeah, so let's actually look at a page, and I can answer pretty specific. So in both cases, the actual data points themselves. Let me get a metric here that is. So this data on this site, Cardo, Cardo.com is basically a full GIS mapping stack and data store as a service is a way to think about it. So in the past, so county health rankings, we stood up in AWS Postgres GIS that has all of the chloropleth data for the counties and the individual data points, right? So the actual metric for this, the actual value for this metric for this year for this county is in a big Postgres database. For this project, which was built, half a decade after the first version of county health rankings, we didn't want to have to babysit all that infrastructure, and we're using Cardo, which provides that same service basically. And here, I'll pull it up. It's we're a partner of theirs. So Cardo provides a GIS-specific data store and tile streaming and some data analysis tools that you can use, and a nice API. So they give us an API, and we're actually pulling data directly from Cardo. So that map that we're looking at right here, this is pulling data from Cardo's API. We're using JSON to drive a lot of that stuff. And well, actually, these chloropleths are coming back as, you might know more than I do, John, but it's being driven by Cardo itself. The name on this page, Atlanta, Georgia, that's actually stored in Drupal, right? But we're not using Drupal to render this page at all. We're using React to render it. Hopefully, did that get close? Yeah.
So we've had a difficult time finding mapping platforms, specifically with JS, that are accessible to users, that are keyboard only.
Right.
Work well to deliver an equitable experience on a screen reader. Does Cardo do that better than OpenLayers or Leaflet or?
Well, it's interesting because Cardo's kind of cool because they have an API which, if you're a sophisticated developer, you can kind of forego all of their stuff. And in fact, if you look, we're using Leaflet on this, right, for that layer, and we're like using their data API, I believe. I'm a little bit over my depth on some of the tech here, but you can use Cardo's data store and interface with the data-only API and build your map stuff however you want. You could use high charts, you could use whatever. Like you wouldn't have to use them if you're just using their data API. I don't know the answer on Cardo's like accessibility for, but they're.
My question is, how are you delivering that equivalent experience with your maps?
Oh, I think that we are relaying the data, we're relying on table-based data. So from a 508 compliance standpoint, it's a good question. I can get your card and ask our accessibility person. John, do you know anything more about
Maps
this?
are inherently not accessible. It's a
Yeah.
visual element. So I mean, the best we can do is a tabular data set.
Yeah.
The table on the side. We're looking for a solution to for the UN sustainable
Yeah.
development goals.
Yeah.
So they're always asking, does anybody know a way to like render this information, but at the same time it's got to be easily explained.
Right. Well, I think, yeah, I think that this is kind of
It's been the default solution for
Yeah.
a long time, and it just feels like a cop-out.
yeah, I think
Yeah, I
this
think
is an
the other
interesting
thing
thing
is
here.
theory information on it
Yeah.
and provide the table. I mean, that's in the back and forth with the map and all. I mean, that's
It's really interesting. We added this, what we were calling these things sense-making statements. That's where we dropped them in throughout the site. And they didn't come about until after we started doing some usability testing. This wasn't here at all. Yeah, I can cover it up. But we did have this bar, and we had all these icons. I mean, it's just a lot going on, right? And we found that people were like, even though we felt like we had explained it really well, it wasn't until we put in this human readable statement that kind of like translates the chart. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of like a dynamically generated visual, textual interpretation of the visual, which has been really well received by users. So it's not a panacea, but it's something to think about. Yeah.
I mean, Tableau's not open source at all, but Tableau
Right.
has like a lot of like all the points, latitude, longitude.
Yep.
With them, you doesn't have latitude, longitude. You can look it up and put it in because I know like my boss did like the internet show.
Yep.
But it costs money for time.
Yeah, no, Tableau is I think that the biggest difference between, like Carto is a service that's built for delivering web-specific GIS stuff. Tableau can do that via kind of like embeds and that sort of thing. It's a very different technical architecture, and it has some strengths and weaknesses. Its core strength is giving non-developer folks tools for analyzing data on their desktop. Like that's its roots. Like it's largely like a desktop visualization. Now you can make a visualization and plop it into a blog post very easily. Yeah, for example. Other questions? Yeah.
what would you say would be the two biggest lessons learned during the process? Unexpected challenge.
Well, on different spectrums. On the data design side, the City Health Dashboard project in particular, I think that we underestimated the complexity of the data. Data in itself is like inherently, like this data set, if you think about it at a macro level, it really can be one giant table where you've got a census tract, a value, a year, a descriptor of what that value is, right? And that's basically it, right? Like that's the whole data set. We're not talking about big data. It's not streaming data from point of sales cash registers that we're dealing with here. And there was I think a sense that because the data structure is relatively simple, that conveying the meaning of the data would be relatively easy to do. So we went through lots of iteration to get to this kind of sense-making stuff. The fact that some metrics, like lower values are better, and some metrics higher values are better. Some metrics in the middle is better. For some metrics, and we didn't even talk about this, out of the 26 metrics, some they have census tract level data for, some they have demographic data for, some they only have city level data for, and there's different combinations of those three things. So we had to like really spend more time with the data than we had anticipated in order to get to a usable solution. On the tech front, I'm probably the wrong person to ask probably, but I do know that kind of like decision to completely decouple, we're a little bit nervous that it might, because it is at the end of the day a website and the features that we want to add onto it, we might have to like figure out a way to make it more like progressively decoupled in order to roll out new kind of web content centric features to the site as it grows. Yeah. Other questions? Well, if no other questions, we can sit here and stare at each other. We can go home. Okay. Thank you, guys. Yes. Oh, you've been sitting here patiently waiting for you.
It's okay, but your talk was really great. Sorry, I came in a little bit.
No,
Once
it's,
I realized.
yeah.
But it is cool.